Kansas, April 1925. Elias Thorne was building an absurdity. Every man, woman, and child in Prosperity County could see it. While his neighbors raised proud, white-painted timber frames against the vast, empty sky, Elias was digging. He wasn't just digging a foundation, he was excavating a massive trench, a long, curved wound in the prairie earth, as if preparing a grave for a giant. He worked alone, stripped to the waist under the relentless sun, his back a map of sinew and scars from a war he never spoke of. He used a mule and scoop for the heavy work, but the final shaping was done with a spade, his movements economical and precise. Passers-by on the county road would slow their wagons, staring at the strange man and his enormous ditch. They saw him hauling field stones, hundreds of them, clearing them from his own and his neighbor's land, piling them like the cairns of some forgotten tribe. He was building something low, rounded, and made of rock, something that belonged in an older, darker world. Silas Croft, the county's most respected builder, the man whose hands had framed nearly every new barn and home for 20 miles, had called it a medieval fantasy. Others were less kind. They called it Thorne's Barrow, a tomb, a monument to foolishness dug into the plains. The name stuck. Yet Elias never offered a word in his own defense. He just kept digging, kept hauling stone, his face set in a mask of quiet determination. The spectacle became a form of local entertainment. Men would stop by on their way from the fields, lean on the fence posts, and watch him work. They saw a man building not up towards the promise of the American sky, but down into the unforgiving dirt. They saw a man choosing stone in an age of milled lumber, choosing curves in an age of straight lines. What did this quiet veteran, this outsider from the crowded cities of the East, understand about the prairie that decades of experience had hidden from everyone else? What secret was he burying in that strange stone shell? The answer was coming. It was gathering force in the unstable air hundreds of miles away, and when it arrived, it would not be a whisper but a roar that would scour the land clean of everything but the truth. The Great Plains in the 1920s were a place of brutal contradictions. The land offered a boundless horizon, a sense of infinite possibility that drew families from across the nation. It promised fertile soil, a chance to own something real, to build a life from the rich, black earth. But the sky, that same symbol of freedom, held a terrible power. It was a vast, indifferent engine of weather, capable of breathtaking beauty one moment and unspeakable violence the next. The true ruler of this land was the wind. It was a constant presence, a whisper that could become a shriek without warning. In the winter, it carried blizzards that could bury a house in a single night. In the summer, it baked the land dry and carried the threat of fire. But its most terrifying form came in the spring. That was when the sky itself could curdle, turning a sickly shade of green-gray, and the wind would fall into an eerie, unnatural silence. Every settler knew this silence. It was the deepest fear in their hearts, a quiet that was louder than any storm. It was the prelude to the tornado. These storms were not rare events. They were a feature of the landscape, a seasonal reaping. A man could build a fine house, a testament to his hard work and prosperity, and see it wiped from the earth in less than a minute. A family could sit down to dinner and find themselves moments later scattered across a field with nothing left but the foundation of their home. The conventional wisdom, born of bitter experience, was the storm cellar. It was a small, subterranean pit, usually dug a short distance from the house, lined with timber or stone, and covered with heavy wooden doors. It was a place of last resort, a cramped, dark hole where a family would huddle, listening to the world being torn apart above them. The cellar saved lives, but it did not save livelihoods. It did not save homes. It did not save the years of labor and hope invested in a farm. A family could emerge from the cellar, blinking in the strange post-storm light, to find their existence erased. Silas Croft was the master of the conventional. His houses were models of modern efficiency. He used balloon framing, a technique that was fast, strong for its weight, and economical with lumber. His walls were straight, his corners square, his roofs pitched at a perfect angle to shed rain and snow. He built good, solid houses for the time, houses that stood up to the ordinary furies of the plains. But he knew, as everyone knew, that against a direct hit from a major tornado, a timber frame house was little more than a pile of kindling waiting for a match. The immense pressure differential and the violent winds would lift the roof, the walls would fold, and the structure would disintegrate. The cellar was the only answer. The house was considered a temporary, replaceable thing. Elias Thorne saw it differently. He had come to Kansas, not for the land, but for the air. His wife, Clara, suffered from a lung ailment that the doctors in Philadelphia said could only be helped by the dry, clean climate of the West. She was the center of his world, a delicate woman whose quiet strength had seen him through the darkness after his return from the war. He had 2 young children, a boy and a girl, who had her same wide, trusting eyes. His entire life was now dedicated to their safety and peace. His experience was not in building houses to stand, but in building fortifications to withstand the very worst humanity could invent. In the trenches of France, as a sapper, he hadn't worked with timber frames and neat angles. He had worked with sandbags, corrugated iron, earth, and stone. He had learned the physics of blast waves and artillery shells. He knew that the most resilient shapes in nature were curves, and the strongest defense was not to stand tall against a force, but to present a low profile and use the earth itself as a shield. He had spent years in dugouts and bunkers that shuddered under the impact of high explosives, but did not collapse. He saw the tornadoes of the plains not as a weather phenomenon, but as a form of artillery fired from the sky, and he intended to build a bunker, not a house. He watched his neighbors build their tall, vulnerable homes and their separate, desperate cellars. He saw the logic, but he rejected the premise. Why, he wondered, should a family have to abandon their home to survive? Why should the shelter be a dark pit of fear, separate from the warmth and life of the hearth? He believed the home itself should be the sanctuary. The entire structure, not just a hole in the ground, should be the fortress. This singular, unshakable conviction was the foundation for the absurdity taking shape in his field. The construction of Thorne's barrow began not with a frame, but with a form. After excavating the wide, shallow pit, Elias and his mule spent weeks dragging timbers to the site. But he wasn't building walls. He was building a massive curved skeleton, a temporary wooden arch that mirrored the shape he envisioned for his home. This structure, called centering, would support the stones of his arch until the final keystone was in place, and the entire structure became self-supporting. It was a technique as old as the Romans, something Silas Croft had only ever read about in books on cathedrals. "What in God's name is that for, Thorne?" Silas asked one afternoon, reining in his horse at the edge of the property. He had made it a point to check on the strange project, feeling a mix of professional curiosity and genuine concern. "It's the form," Elias replied simply, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a calloused hand. He didn't stop his work, fitting another piece of planking onto the curved ribs of the centering. Silas dismounted, his boots sinking slightly into the piles of excavated dirt. He was a tall man, confident in his craft, and he looked at the sprawling wooden skeleton with a practiced, critical eye. That's a hell of a lot of lumber to build a temporary brace. You could have framed 2 walls with what you've got there. You're going to bury it? No, Elias said, his voice patient, as if explaining to a child. I will build the stone arch over it. Then I will take it apart from the inside. Silas shook his head, a slow, pitying motion. An arch? Made of fieldstone? Elias, that's not how you build a house. You can't run wiring through it. You can't insulate it properly. It'll sweat with condensation day and night. In the winter, you'll have a layer of ice on the inside of your walls. He pointed a finger at the pile of stones. And that rock has no integrity. It's granite, limestone, sandstone all mixed. They expand and contract at different rates. Your mortar will crack, and the whole thing will come down on your family's heads. Every objection Silas raised was logical. It was based on the accumulated wisdom of prairie construction. A stone structure was thermally inefficient. It would bleed heat in the winter and be slow to warm. The porous nature of the local stone and mortar would wick moisture from the surrounding earth, creating a perpetually damp, unhealthy environment. It was by every known standard a terrible idea. The earth will insulate it, Elias said, still not looking up. And the shape is strong. The shape is strong for a bridge, maybe, Silas countered, his voice rising with frustration. But it's a dungeon, not a home. Where are your windows? A house needs light. Your wife and children will get sick in a place like that. It's not right. There will be windows at the front and back, Elias said calmly. It will be enough. The conversation was over. Elias returned to his work, his hammer blows echoing with a steady rhythm. Silas stood for a long moment, watching the man he considered a fool. He felt a genuine pang of sorrow for Thorne's wife and children. He mounted his horse and rode away, solidifying the story he would tell at the mercantile that evening. The story of the madman building a stone tomb in his field, deaf to reason, deaf to common sense. The mockery grew louder as the stones went up. Elias was a patient mason, choosing each rock with care, chipping and shaping it to fit snugly against its neighbors. He mixed his own mortar, a rich blend of sand, lime, and cement that he guarded jealously. He worked from the base of the arch upwards, laying course after course of stone over the wooden centering. It was slow, back-breaking labor. Weeks turned into months. The arch grew, a great stone spine rising from the earth. At the trading post, the talk was merciless. Heard Thorne is building a home for the moles, not for men. At the church social, the women whispered, pitying poor Clara Thorne, having to live in such a primitive dwelling. The children in the one-room schoolhouse taunted the Thorne boy, asking if his father was a caveman. Thorne's barrow became a landmark of local folly, a cautionary tale in the making. Elias ignored it all. He was focused on the physics of his creation. He was building a catenary arch. It wasn't a perfect semicircle, but a gentler, more stable curve, the same shape a heavy chain makes when hung between 2 points. This shape, he knew, was uniquely powerful. It channeled all the vertical weight of the stones and the earth that would eventually cover them down into the foundation, converting vertical pull into horizontal compression. The stones of the arch were not being pulled apart. They were being squeezed together, making the structure stronger the heavier the load upon it. Once the arch was complete and the final wedge-shaped keystone was hammered into place at the apex, he let the mortar cure for a full month. Then came the moment of truth. From inside, he carefully began to dismantle the massive wooden centering, piece by piece. His son watched, his small face filled with a mixture of fear and awe. With the final support removed, the stone arch stood on its own, a massive, self-supporting vault. It held. It was as solid as the bedrock beneath it. But Elias was not done. He then began the most counterintuitive step of all. He brought the mule and scooped back and started piling the excavated earth against and over the stone structure. He buried his own house. He packed the soil deep against the stone walls, creating thick earthen berms that sloped gently up to the roof line. He covered the top of the arch with layers of tar paper for waterproofing, and then covered that with more than 2 feet of soil. He planted the thick prairie grass on top, so that when he was finished, his home barely rose from the landscape. It looked like a natural hill, a gentle swelling in the earth, with a stone facade at the front and back where he had left openings for a door and windows. His system was an integrated whole, a lung beneath the prairie. The thick stone walls and the surrounding earth created an immense thermal mass. In the summer, the house would passively absorb the day's heat, remaining cool inside long after the sun had set. In the winter, the stored warmth from a small, efficient wood stove would radiate slowly back from the stone, keeping the interior at a stable, comfortable temperature for hours, long after the fire had died down. The earth berming was not just insulation, it was a shield. It would deflect the prairie winds, allowing them to flow over the low, curved roofline instead of battering against flat, vulnerable walls. It was a design born of siege warfare, applied to domestic life. It was a fortress disguised as a hillock. The day they finally moved in, Silas Croft made one last visit. He stood inside the main room, a long, vaulted space that felt surprisingly airy due to the light pouring in from the large windows on the south-facing facade. He ran his hand along the exposed stone of the interior wall. It was cool to the touch, but dry. "It's a tomb, Elias," he said, his voice low. "It's solid, I'll grant you that. But when the wind comes for it, this thing won't break. It won't fly apart like a frame house. It will collapse. All at once, this weight will crush you." "It will hold," Elias said, placing a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. "We will be safe here." Silas shook his head and left. He had done his duty as a neighbor. He had warned him. Now, whatever happened was on Elias Thorne's own head. Spring arrived late that year, in a surge of humid, unstable air from the Gulf. The days grew warm and sticky, and the prairie grasses exploded in a riot of green. But the sky held a warning. The clouds built higher each afternoon, great white anvils with dark, bruised-looking bases. The air felt heavy, charged with a nervous energy that made the livestock restless and put everyone on edge. The old-timers looked at the sky, chewed their tobacco, and said something was coming. Something bad. The day began like any other. A hazy sun burned through a high layer of buttermilk clouds. Elias worked on his fences, while Clara tended her garden near the front of the house. The children played in the yard, their laughter carrying on the gentle breeze. But by mid-afternoon, the breeze died. A profound, unnatural stillness fell over the land. The birds went silent. The air grew thick and acquired a strange, metallic taste. To the southwest, the horizon began to darken. Not the familiar gray of a thunderstorm, but a sickly, greenish-black stain that was spreading across the sky. Elias stopped his work, his eyes fixed on the approaching wall of cloud. He had seen skies like this in wartime paintings of poisoned landscapes. He felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He called to Clara and the children. "Inside, now!" There was no alarm in his voice, only a firm, quiet command that they obeyed without question. Inside the stone house, he barred the heavy oak door. He checked the stout wooden shutters he had built for the windows and bolted them from the inside. The light vanished, plunging the room into a twilight gloom. He lit a single kerosene lamp, its yellow flame casting long, dancing shadows up the curved stone walls. The silence from outside was now so complete, it felt like a pressure against the eardrums. Miles away, Silas Croft was also watching the sky from his porch. He stood beside his wife, his arm around her shoulders. He had built this house with his own hands. It was his masterpiece, a two-story farmhouse with a wide veranda and intricate gingerbread trim. It was the very symbol of his success and skill. He looked at the approaching storm, and for the first time in his life, he felt that his creation was nothing more than a house of cards. "Get the children to the cellar," he said to his wife, his voice tight. "I'll get the lamps." The community was in a state of controlled panic. Families scrambled to secure their livestock and gather their most precious belongings. The sky was now a terrifying spectacle. The green-black mass was boiling, churning, and from its base, a small, dark funnel cloud descended. It seemed to hesitate for a moment, a tentative finger probing the earth. Then it touched down, and it grew. The distant funnel swelled into a monstrous, churning column of blackness, a mile wide at its base, roaring with the sound of 1,000 freight trains. It moved with a horrifying speed, scouring the prairie, erasing everything in its path. Trees were torn from the ground and thrown like matchsticks. Barns and outbuildings simply vanished. Silas and his family huddled in their cellar. The wooden doors bolted above them. They could hear the roar growing, a deafening, all-consuming vortex of sound. The ground began to tremble. There was a high-pitched shriek of tortured wood, then a splintering crash that sounded like the end of the world. Debris rained down on the cellar doors, thudding like giant fists. Then, as quickly as it began, the loudest noise faded, replaced by the sound of wind and falling rain. Inside Thorne's barrow, the experience was profoundly different. They heard the roar, but it was muffled, a deep, resonant rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself. The stone structure did not shake. The lamp on the table did not flicker. The air pressure changed, making their ears pop. But the house was an island of impossible calm in the heart of the maelstrom. Elias stood with his hand on the cool stone wall, feeling the deep vibrations of the storm. But the wall was unmoving. It was like being inside a mountain. His son, who had been terrified, looked at his father's calm face and slowly relaxed. Clara held their daughter close, humming a soft lullaby. They were not in a shelter. They were home. The storm passed. A strange, heavy silence returned, punctuated by the drip of rain and the distant, mournful lowing of a lost cow. After a few minutes, Silas pushed against the cellar doors. They were blocked by something heavy. He and his oldest son put their shoulders to the wood and heaved. The doors gave way with a groan, and they climbed out into a world that was no longer there. His house was gone. Completely. The foundation was wiped clean. Splintered lumber, furniture, and personal belongings were strewn for hundreds of yards across the field. His barn was a pile of rubble. The landscape was a ruin, a gray, flattened wasteland under a weeping sky. His wife began to sob, a sound of pure, desolate grief. Silas stood in shock, his mind unable to process the totality of the destruction. He was the best builder in the county, and his home had been annihilated in seconds. Then a thought pierced through his daze. Thorne, the madman with the stone house. A cold spike of guilt and fear shot through him. He pictured that immense weight of stone collapsing, crushing the family he had warned. He had mocked the man, but he had never wished him harm. He had to know. The journey was a nightmare. The road was gone, replaced by a trail of debris. He stumbled through a landscape of wreckage, his feet sinking into the mud. He saw the remains of his neighbors' farms, twisted pieces of metal, a child's doll lying face down in the dirt. The entire community of prosperity had been scoured from the map. He dreaded what he would find at the Thorne property. He prepared himself for the sight of a collapsed pile of rock and earth. As he crested the last rise, he stopped dead. His heart hammered against his ribs. It was there, standing, Thorn's barrow was still there. The prairie around it was a wasteland, stripped bare to the soil. Trees nearby were splintered stumps, but the low, curved structure was intact. It looked as if it had grown from the earth, an ancient and undisturbed feature of the land. The grass on its roof was ruffled, and some of the soil had been washed away, but the house stood. He broke into a run, stumbling and sliding in the mud. He had to see inside. He had to understand. He pounded on the heavy oak door, his knuckles raw. "Thorn, Elias, are you in there?" The bolt slid back, and the door swung open. Elias Thorn stood there, holding the kerosene lamp. He was unharmed. Behind him, Silas could see Clara and the two children, sitting at a simple wooden table. The children were eating bread and jam. The room was calm, dry, and warm. A wave of warm air, smelling of wood smoke and baked bread, washed over Silas, a stark contrast to the cold, damp ruin of the world outside. Silas stared, speechless. He took a hesitant step inside, his muddy boots leaving tracks on the clean floor. His eyes darted around the room, taking in the impossible scene of domestic tranquility. It was as if the storm had never happened. He was as if the storm had never happened. He was as if the storm had never happened. He was as if the storm had never happened. He was as if the storm had never happened. He was as if the storm had never happened. He was as if the storm had never happened. He was as if the storm had never happened. He was as if the storm had never happened. He was as if the storm had never happened. He was as if the storm had never happened. He was as if the storm had never happened. He was as if the storm had never happened. He was as if the storm had never happened. He was as if the storm had never happened. He was as if the storm had never happened. He was as if the storm had never happened. He was as if the storm had never happened. He was as if the storm had never happened. He was as if the storm had never happened. He was as if the storm had never happened. He was as if the storm had never happened. He was as if the storm had never happened. He was as if the storm had never happened. He was as if the storm had never happened. He was as if the storm had never happened. He was as if the storm had never happened. He was as if the storm had never happened. He was as if the storm had never happened. He was as if the storm had never happened. He was as if the storm had never happened. He was as if the storm had never happened. He was as if the storm had never happened. He was as if the storm had never happened. He was as if the storm had never happened. He was as if the storm had never happened. He was as if the storm had never happened. He was as if the storm had never happened. He was as if the storm had never happened. He was as if the storm had never happened. He was as if the storm had never happened. He was as if the storm had never happened. He was as if the storm had never happened. He was as if the storm had never happened. He was as if the storm had never happened. He was as if the storm had never happened. He was as if the storm had never happened. He was as if the storm had never happened. He was as if the storm had never happened. He was as if the storm had never happened. He was as if the storm had never happened. He was as if the storm had never happened. He was as if the storm had never happened. He was as if the storm had never happened. He was as if the storm had never happened. He was as if the storm had never happened. He was as if the storm had never happened. He was as if the storm had never happened. He was as if the storm had never happened. He was as if the storm was as if the storm had never happened. He walked to the wall, the same wall he had touched in condescension weeks before. He pressed his palm flat against the cold, solid stone. He felt nothing but immense, unyielding strength. He looked at the vaulted ceiling, the beautiful, simple curve of the interlocking stones, and he finally saw it not as a primitive arch, but as a piece of profound engineering. He turned back to Elias, his face a mixture of awe and shame. "How?" he whispered. It was the only word he could manage. "The wind," Elias said simply, his voice devoid of any triumph. "It doesn't fight the curve. It just flows over, and the weight holds it to the ground." Silas walked the length of the room, his builder's eye now seeing everything differently. He saw how the deep-set windows were protected by the thick walls. He saw how the heavy, low profile offered almost no surface for the wind to purchase. He understood in a flash of insight that shattered his professional pride that Elias hadn't built a house to resist the storm. He had built a house the storm could not even see. It was an exercise in aerodynamics, not just brute strength. He went back to the door and looked out at the flattened world. His own home, a model of modern construction, was a scrap heap. His neighbors' homes were gone. The church, the mercantile, all of it wiped away. The data was not in numbers on a page, but in the brutal physical evidence all around him. The score was 1-0. One structure survived. One idea had worked. He turned back to Elias, meeting his gaze. The quiet innovator wasn't gloating. There was no "I told you so" in his eyes, only a deep, weary calm. In that moment, Silas Croft, the expert, the respected voice of tradition, understood the depth of his own ignorance. "I was wrong," Silas said, the words feeling foreign and difficult in his mouth. "Everything I told you, everything I thought I knew, it was wrong. This place, you saved your family. You built the only thing that could have survived." He took a deep, shuddering breath. "Elias, you have to teach me. You have to teach us all." In the days that followed, the story spread like wildfire through the devastated communities. Survivors, huddled in makeshift shelters, spoke in hushed, awestruck tones about Thorn's Barrow, the house that stood. The name that had been a term of mockery became a badge of honor, a symbol of impossible survival. The aftermath of the tornado was a scene of communal grief and resolve. Help arrived, and the slow, arduous process of clearing the wreckage began. But as people started to think about rebuilding, a new question hung in the air, a question that challenged a generation of prairie wisdom. How had Thorn's house survived? Silas Croft, his own authority shattered and then remade, became the idea's most fervent apostle. He brought other builders and community leaders to the small, earth-burned home. They came as skeptics and left as converts. They walked through the calm, secure interior. They ran their hands over the solid stone walls. They listened as Elias, in his quiet, unassuming way, explained the principles of the catenary arch, of thermal mass, of earth-burning and aerodynamics. He used no fancy terms, just simple, practical language, often drawing shapes in the dirt with a stick to illustrate his points. He spoke of how the arch redirected the immense weight of the earth, making the structure stronger, not weaker. He explained how the earth itself was the finest insulation imaginable, moderating the brutal temperature swings of the plains. Most importantly, he explained how the low, curved profile allowed the wind to move over it, like water over a smooth stone in a river, rather than smashing against a flat wall. The first to replicate the design was Silas himself. Working alongside Elias, he began construction on a new home, not of timber, but of stone and earth. His professional pride was replaced by a student's humility. He learned the patient art of masonry, the ancient geometry of the arch. His new house was not an exact copy. It was larger, with more windows on the southern face to capture the winter sun, a testament to his own expertise, blending with Elias's revolutionary concept. Soon others followed. The Thorn House, as it came to be known, became the new standard for resilient construction in the region. Not everyone could build a full stone arch, but the principles were adapted. People began building their new frame houses with a lower profile. They started berming earth against the north walls of their homes to shield them from winter winds. The storm cellar wasn't abandoned, but it was often integrated into the foundation of the house itself, a reinforced sanctuary within the home, not a separate pit in the yard. Elias Thorn never sought fame or fortune from his innovation. He charged no one for his knowledge. He would spend his Saturdays helping a neighbor lay a foundation, or explaining the proper mix for mortar. His payment was seeing the community rebuild, not with the same vulnerability as before, but with a new sense of security and permanence. His motivation had always been the safety of his own family, and his reward was seeing that safety extended to the families of his neighbors, the same people who had once ridiculed him. The real impact wasn't measured in architectural drawings or construction contracts, it was measured in peace of mind. It was measured in the quiet confidence of a family sitting down to dinner while the wind howled outside, knowing their walls were strong. It was measured in the children who could sleep through a thunderstorm without fear. It was measured in the profound, fundamental shift from seeing a home as a temporary shelter to seeing it as a permanent sanctuary, a fortress rooted in the very earth it stood upon. Elias Thorne had not just built a house, he had given his community a future, one stone at a time. The story of Elias Thorne and his stone house is a powerful lesson. It speaks to the conflict between entrenched tradition and disruptive innovation, and the courage required to trust an idea that everyone else dismisses as foolish. It highlights the arrogance of assuming that the conventional way is the only way, and the wisdom of listening to outsider perspectives, especially those forged in the crucible of extreme experience. Elias's knowledge was not new, it was ancient. The principles of the arch and earth sheltering were known to builders for millennia, but he applied that old wisdom to a new and terrifying problem, creating a solution that was perfectly adapted to its environment. His story is a testament to the power of empirical evidence. In the face of catastrophe, theories and opinions become meaningless. What works, works. The undeniable proof of his standing home silenced every critic and transformed a community. The concepts he used are more relevant today than ever. We see them in modern resilient architecture, in the design of hurricane-proof homes and earth-sheltered, energy-efficient buildings. The core idea that the safest way to face an overwhelming force is not always through rigid opposition, but through intelligent design that respects and redirects that force, is a timeless engineering principle. It reminds us that sometimes the most advanced solution is the one that is most in harmony with the world around it. This telling, including the characters, names, and specific events, is a fictionalized dramatization created for educational and entertainment purposes. It is inspired by the real historical principles of earth-sheltered construction and the challenges faced by pioneers in harsh environments. This narrative does not constitute professional engineering or construction advice.